It's Maundy Thursday, the night we remember how Jesus went away with his disciples to an upper room in Jerusalem, celebrated a supper with them, and also instituted the Lord's Supper, something we celebrate when we get together at the first of every month, celebrating Holy Communion together as a church. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper painting is probably one of the most iconic Christian images we have in our world today. I found this picture on Facebook this week. It shows Da Vinci's Last Supper pictured as if it was during the days of social distancing that we're experiencing. I've been conflicted in recent weeks with the first Sunday of the month, with Maundy Thursday coming up. What do we do about communion? Very early on, we purchased this thing called the Celebration Cup. Purchased a bunch of these, anticipating that we were going to be still worshiping together, but just trying to keep very separate from each other as far as we could.
The Celebration Cup is self-contained. You peel back the top and you've got an unleavened wafer to eat, and then you peel back a second seal and you've got juice to drink for your communion.
But I thought, well, how can we have communion on this special night of Maundy Thursday? And I just couldn't think of a safe way to do it. I thought, well, could have people come by and pick up cups or somehow drop them off for people. There was also the route that some other churches are taking of having people get their own elements, get their own juice and bread, or use what they have at home and doing some kind of online communion. But I think all of that would break the essence of what communion is. It's a participation in, it's a sharing together in the same space of the presence of Christ, of these gifts of bread and juice that symbolize his broken body, his shed blood. Let's take some time to long for that, to long when we can do that again together, to experience the sharing of this sacrament together in the same place. When we look at what went on that first Thursday evening when Jesus called his disciples together for a meal, we see their closeness that was expressed. We see it in the Gospel of John. Years ago, I was taught about triclinium meals by one of my teachers, Dr. Charles Page, and it's changed the way I've viewed the Last Supper ever since. A common image of the Last Supper comes from Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting of the Last Supper. So we're used to seeing a table set up like this with Jesus and his 12 disciples. But in the first century, we read in the Gospels about various places where Jesus is reclining at table. Today, scholars believe that the Last Supper meal would have been a reclining meal that was eaten at something called a triclinium table, with 3 tables, a place where servants could go in and serve everyone, but the people would recline around the table, resting on their elbows, on their left elbows, and leaning a certain way. There was a certain order. Now, as the Last Supper is depicted in the Gospels, it appears that Jesus is the host at the supper, and the host at the triclinium would be in this position. Then there would be a guest of honor, and that guest of honor was actually Judas. That guest of honor would be in this position. A lesser honored guest would be to the other side of the host, and it's likely John, from what we'll hear a little bit later on, John the disciple. And the least position would have been here at the end of the table, and that is likely where Peter was, which we'll hear a little bit later. So we don't know where the other disciples were, but we'll just sort of fill them in. Oh, I've got these guys going the wrong way. Everybody's facing on their left elbow. In Near Eastern society, you don't eat with your left hand. The left hand is considered unclean because it was used for personal hygiene. So our all-important toilet paper these days is not held in the right hand, it's in the left hand.
The triclinium is attested to in historical sources and archaeological sites. Here's a picture I took in Sepphoris, which was the capital of Galilee during part of Jesus' life, and it's about 4 miles away from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. This mosaic comes from the 2nd century AD.
And during the first century, there was a custom that people eating the Passover should eat the Passover as a reclining meal because God made all Jews wealthy when they were delivered from slavery to freedom during the Exodus from Egypt. If we look closely at John, we can see how a triclinium meal is expressed there. The seats and positions of people were arranged so that the VIP seating was on the left-hand side. And starting from the left side and moving around to the right, the seats were arranged in a descending order of importance. The last place to the right, in the right-hand corner, was the place of least importance. The person sitting here usually had the responsibility of washing the feet of the guests at a formal meal. It says that Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. When he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "I am doing what you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." I wonder if Peter was embarrassed that Jesus got up and took that towel and went around to wash the disciples' feet, when that should have been his job. Jesus shows us that he takes a lowly place. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Later on during the supper, after Jesus had said these things, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. That's why we think that John would have been in the position of the attendant right next to Jesus, and that Peter, being at the lowest position, would have been facing him and would have been easily able to look over and them to see each other face to face, and Peter to ask him of whom he was speaking. And then that disciple, who we think is John, it says, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do, do quickly." The host would always occupy position 2 at the table. The attendant would sit or recline in position 1. The guest of honor was placed at position 3. And in order to speak to the host, John, the attendant, would have to lay his head back against Jesus' chest. To speak to the guest of honor, Jesus would have had to lay his back against the chest of the guest of honor. How do we know Judas was in that position? All of the gospel writers agree that Judas, the betrayer, was the one who was dipping into the bowl with Jesus, or was the recipient of the sop given by Jesus. To offer the sop, the host would take bread, break it, and dip it into a sauce or salad and offer it to one of the guests. The first recipient of the sop is always the guest of honor. And John tells us that Judas was the recipient of the sop. And seated in the position 3, John wants us to somehow say, ironically, that Judas, who would betray Jesus, was his guest of honor at the Last Supper. Isn't it amazing that Jesus, knowing Judas was going to betray him, made him the guest of honor that night? It seems to make it all the more tragic how Judas, after betraying Jesus, in his own humiliation, guilt, and shame, Judas left himself to his own devices and took his own life. If you ever feel like you're just too far from the Lord, that things are too bad, consider who was put in the guest of honor, who Jesus chose to be in the guest of honor. The grace that Jesus shows, it's powerful. It's there for us. We don't have to wallow in our sin, guilt, or shame. I bet there's a guest of honor position open for us if we would just claim it.